Welcome everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Alternative Frequencies, the Supernatural, in your living room. I'm your host, Stephen Hill, author, electronic medium, DJ of the dead, and creepy voice on your radio. So happy that you could join me this evening. I have a very interesting show on tap for you. My special guest, Andrea Perron, is the author of the book House of Darkness, House of Light. Now, Andrea is writing the trilogy of the true story of her haunting, and we seem to have much in common. I can't wait to have her on and find out more. But before we do, I'd like to give a big shout out to the great folks over at the Hazy Radio Network and also my new affiliate, Birmingham City Radio UK. So greetings to all my friends across the pond. I'm so glad to be with you this evening. Now, Andrea's story reminds me of a case that I was recently called into, that of a Victorian-era farmhouse that seemed to have some rather haunting activity take place shortly after they began renovations. I'd like to share that story with you right after this quick break, so please stick around.
Dixie Ghostland Perron, Aiken, South Carolina, July the 27th and 28th, 2013. www.lightstream-media.com. 4 major paranormal and historical hotspots, paranormal celebrities, paranormal acknowledgments and awards. Come see paranormal celebrity Blaine Rohan of Scare Radio International, Stephen Hill, author of Something Unseen and radio host of Alternative Frequencies, Andrea Perron, author of the trilogy House of Darkness, House of Light, Jason Staton of Ghost Chat Radio, the Paranormal Rebel with Sepia, co-manager of TAPS, Jeff Leeper. Also see Daryl Campbell of My Ghost Story Caught on Camera, the entire team of paranormal pros, Kim Brulette and Chris Matheny, co-authors of Secrets in the Shallows, and radio hosts. See the Bama Boys of Deep South Paranormal, Sci-Fi, and Keith Age of Spook TV and the Orb Tones. Come to Dixie Ghostland Paracon, www.lightstream-media.com.
If you'd like to find out more about Something Unseen, you can do so by visiting Amazon. Check out The True Story of My Haunting, Something Unseen.
The opinions and views expressed on this program may not necessarily be those of the Hazy Radio Network, Birmingham City Radio Network, its sponsors, affiliates, or those on the other side.
You're listening to Alternative Frequencies with host Stephen Hill. Now back to the show.
Now I'd like to share with you The Farmer's Ghost, the story of a true haunting, in a case that I was recently involved in. So here it is. Enjoy.
In the year 2000, a young couple purchased the old Miller place, which is a Victorian-era farmhouse that once sat on many acres of land here on the outskirts of my hometown. Not long after moving in, the oldest son, who was at the time 6, came to his parents in the middle of the night, claiming that a man was in his room. He said the man was trying to speak to him, and he could see his lips moving, but could hear no words. He also said the man was wearing a hat and had a red neck. Now, his parents, thinking this was just the overactive imagination of a 6-year-old child in a strange house, dismissed it as such and thought no more about it until 8 years later. Renovation projects had recently begun on the house, to accommodate their quickly growing family. That's when the mysterious activity began to take place. Televisions would mysteriously turn on and off by themselves. Objects left on the table would often be found elsewhere in the house the next morning. And then one night, their daughter, who was now 4 years old, came to them and said, "There's a man in my room. He has a yucky neck. He's trying to speak to me, but he can't talk." Now, remembering the story their son had told, which seemed to be almost the same verbatim, along with the other unexplained occurrences that had been taking place since the renovations had begun, caused them to wonder, could our beautiful home actually be haunted, and if so, by whom? They invited an amateur group of ghost hunters in to try to collect some form of data to support this theory, or perhaps give them a rational explanation for the things they had been experiencing. Unfortunately, they were unable to do so. That's when I was contacted, and hoping I could give spirit a voice through the use of my electronic mediumship, because if you'll recall, the spirit, according to the children, was trying to speak but could not. During my first visit there, I conducted a radio sweep session, and there were quite a few people present during this first visit. And here's the only concrete word or response from the entity that I believe is haunting their home.
You want us to stay or go? Go?
Go.
You want us to stay or go? Go?
Go.
I found this case to be rather odd, as usually the spirits I contact will have plenty to say once they figure out that, yes, we do have a means of hearing them. I was invited back for a return visit a week later, when only the immediate family members were present. Again, I tried to contact the entity. He didn't have a whole lot to say, but here is another, what I believe to be concrete piece of information that he did choose to divulge to me on that evening.
Stay in the south, yes or no? No, yes or no? Stay in the south, yes or no? No, yes or no?
Now, what I heard in that response was, of course, it's my farm when I asked, do you stay in this house? I've run into situations before where the spirit doesn't seem to realize that he has passed, and I wondered if this was the case with this one. So the next thing I asked, are you dead or alive? And at least he had a sense of humor.
Are you dead or alive?
dead or alive? Now, this is an ongoing investigation, and the family has stayed in close contact with me regarding further activity in their home. But what did we learn from this visit? Well, let's review. Number one, he doesn't seem to want them there. Number two, he does stay in the house because, after all, it is his farm, at least as far as he is concerned. Number three, he does have a sense of humor and seems to realize that he has passed.
And I'll be bringing you further updates on this case as they evolve. We're going to be right back with my special guest, Andrea Perron, author of House of Darkness, House of Light, right after this break.
The views and opinions expressed on this network do not reflect anyone here. Thank goodness, because there's a reason we're all on radio instead of TV. Therefore, we shall not be responsible for any personal injury, property damage, accident, delay, world wars, sudden appearance of unwanted nose hairs or blemishes, collapse of the World Bank, freak accidents, delays, or inconvenience, or more importantly, being out of chocolate fudge ripple ice cream at Ben & Jerry's.
Ay, caramba!
We take responsibility for nothing. We know nothing and will admit to nothing.
You're listening to Alternative Frequencies with host Stephen Hill. Now back to the show.
And if you're just tuning in, I'm Stephen Hill, and this is Alternative Frequencies. If you'd like to join us in the chat room, just go to hazyradio.com, click on the on-air chat button right there on the home page, and you can join the conversation with all the other great folks right here on Alternative Frequencies. I'm very happy that we're back here live with my special guest tonight, author Andrea Perron, author of House of Darkness, House of Light, and I just have been looking so forward to having her on. Andrea, are you out there?
Oh, Stephen, I am so out there that I'm barely here.
Well, we're going to get along great. I guarantee. Well, thanks for taking your time, and welcome to Alternative Frequencies. And one thing I wanted to ask you, when your parents purchased the farmhouse where your story began, the last words the former occupant said to you were, "Be sure to leave the lights on at night." Now, how long did it take you to realize what he meant by that piece of advice?
Well, we didn't even know about it for quite some time. My father, he took my dad outside in the middle of a snowstorm for a walk. So obviously he had something to impart. But he laid his hand on my father's arm and he said, "Roger, for the sake of your family, leave the lights on at night." Wow. And my father didn't know what to make of that. And it wasn't until months later when he and my mother first sat together and acknowledged that something bizarre was going on in the house, that it occurred to him that Mr. Kenyon was trying to forewarn him. And I don't think that Mr. Kenyon said anything further than that, because I don't think that he wanted to be perceived as a rambling old man. But he didn't know how to put into words what he was trying to warn my father against. And my dad was just oblivious to it. It didn't make sense to him. If he thought anything at all about it, it was, it's a big, dark house, and I've got 5 little girls. They're going to need to find their way to the bathroom during the night at some point, so leave the lights on so nobody trips. That's all that occurred to him about that, until months later when my mother confronted him and said, this house is haunted, and they had their first discussion about it.
Well, what were the experiences that led to that discussion, if I may ask?
Well, it was actually quite a few. We started hearing noises. We started smelling odd. It was beyond odd. It was grotesque. When your nose just gets assaulted by a stench of death. Cold, incredible cold, what I describe in the books as supernatural cold, having nothing to do with winter, having nothing to do with a heating system, a cold that permeates your entire body right to your core. The first day that we moved in, 3 of the 5 children, saw a full-body apparition standing in the dining room watching Mr. Kenyon pack up his final belongings out of the china cabinet. And, bless his heart, he didn't seem to pay any notice to the man. When I saw him, he was full solid. I could see every line on his face, every wrinkle in his pants. I just was a polite little child, and I said hello, but he didn't respond to me. He was fixated. He was looking directly at Mr. Kenyon with a very sweet smile on his face, as if he were saying goodbye. My sisters saw him too. Nancy and Cindy both saw him. Nancy asked my mother who the man was or Cindy asked my mother who the man was in the dining room, and my mom said, "What man? Mr. Kenyon's in there with his son." She said, "No, the other man." She said, "There's no other man, honey." And then Nancy came into the kitchen and said, "That other man that was in the dining room just disappeared." And then nobody spoke of it. Nobody said anything about it for many weeks, if not months. And then my sisters began coming to me and telling me what they were hearing in the house and what they were sensing around them. And Cindy would crawl into bed with me at night. Bless her heart, she was just a little peanut. And she'd cuddle up next to me and say, "I keep hearing voices, I keep hearing voices." And they're all saying the same thing, but it's a lot of them all talking at once. They talk together. And I would say, "Well, what are they saying, honey?" And she'd say, "There are 7 dead soldiers buried in the wall."
Wow. Man, 7 dead soldiers buried in the wall. Now, how did you take this news from your little sister? I mean, did you dismiss it, or?
It was disconcerting, certainly. But I was hearing things myself. I was hearing noises in the boarding room. I was hearing an archaic horn. There's a whole chapter in the book called Clarion Call in Volume 1 about this horn that I heard, and it wasn't until decades later that I happened upon recreation of a Revolutionary War battle elsewhere in Rhode Island, and I heard that horn. It was a call to arms, and I didn't ever realize my whole life what it was that I kept hearing. But when you consider that the property was deeded in 1680 as one of the original Providence plantations, the house was completed as it is now in 1736. So the house was lived in and then built on upon until it reached its finished structure now, in its true colonial era style. But that house existed for decades before the Revolutionary War even began. It was there through that war. It was there through every border skirmish around Rhode Island, coming from Massachusetts and Connecticut, as they tried to infringe upon and claim the little bit of land that Rhode Island was as a colony. And, of course, there was the Civil War, and the house was used as part of the Underground Railroad. Any number of things could have happened in that house. The sense of it being in that house is that it was cluttered with souls, that it was alive with death.
Alive with death. Wow. That is very, very fascinating. Now, were there ever verified that there were soldiers in the wall, or
we never pulled the walls of the house apart? No. Cindy heard them for all the 10 years that we lived there. She said, I asked her one time how many times she heard the voices, and she said thousands. She couldn't put a number on it, but she knew thousands of times that she had heard those voices. They would gather around her when she was in bed. And she shared a room with my sister April, and then later with my sister Christine, before she stole my room when I went off to college. And she thought that by leaving the middle bedroom, which was so active, and taking over my bedroom when I went to school in 1976 and I went out to Pittsburgh, and she found out her rude awakening was that my bedroom was just as active as any other bedroom in the house. It's just that I had an understanding with the spirits, and they would not trouble me or toy with me. I don't know if they were more respectful of me or if they just simply weren't that interested in me. But when I would have manifestations, I could generally just ask them politely to let me do my homework, or to, let me focus on what I was doing, and not have an altercation, as it were, not have an incident or an episode with them. But my sister Cindy was not that fortunate, and even though she had her own relationships and her own understanding with them, they went after her a lot more than any of the siblings. However, my mother is the one that really endured the worst of the haunting in that house. There was a single spirit, a female, Mrs. Warren, Lorraine Warren, always said that it was Bathsheba Sherman. My father thinks that it was Mrs. John Arnold, who lived in the house the century before Bathsheba Sherman. And he said that she was proclaiming herself to be mistress of the house. So Mrs. Warren said that. My father agreed, but he didn't agree on which of the women it was. My mother always insisted that the spirits were not simply passing through, that they somehow belonged to the property. And when you consider that 8 generations of one extended family lived and died in that house before we ever arrived, it makes sense that some of them never left. And what my mom did through several years of extensive historical research on the property, she determined that most of the spirits that were present on the property, not just in the house, but in the barn and on the property, were attached to the house, and they either died by their own hand, or they died such a traumatic or quick death that they did not seem to know they were dead. And that pertained particularly to little Prudence Arnold. She was one of the saddest stories associated with our farm. She was raped and murdered by a farmhand named Bill Horton in 1849, just a few months shy of her 12th birthday. And when she would appear in the house, she would appear inside a mist as though she was trapped and fighting to get out. And she would make a horrendous gurgling sound. And it was because her throat had been cut. And she just didn't seem to understand that she was dead. And my terrible fear for her always was that she was reliving that horrible event over and over again, trapped in some dimension that we have no comprehension of.
Well, and that is very tragic, and it seems, in my experience, that spirits will more readily appear and try to communicate with small children. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because of their innocence.
Yes.
They haven't been told yet that there's no such thing as ghosts, that you don't have an imaginary friend, that you dreamed, what you're claiming as reality. And I think the spirits can sense that. And it's very interesting that, and unfortunately, that your mother had to endure so much of the activity, and that makes perfect sense to me, as in whichever female former occupant of that house probably wanted to be the mistress of the house and probably resented your mother's role there. But I'm just guessing. But that's what it sounds like to me.
Well, I would have to agree with you, but I don't think that it's just children that are supremely sensitive. I think it's children that are touched by spirit in childhood have a tendency to grow to adulthood with great gifts that they don't understand. And a case in point is I have a dear friend in England, in Derbyshire, England, named Stephen Evell, and he goes under the handle Ghost Hunter Steve, and he has been searching his entire life to explain a single incident which occurred when he was just a little boy. He was only 5 years old, and it has been something that, and he's prescient. He just can read your mind instantly, so you better not have anything to hide. And it's funny, when we get on Skype and we're talking to each other, because we're planning in the future on doing a show, kind of a shore-to-shore type thing, where he talks about what's going on in England around the paranormal understanding and activity in a society that's much more accepting. Although Americans are coming a long way, I know you've seen a difference in your lifetime. People are far more accepting, but over there, it's just a given. And when he and I get on Skype, the spiritual interference, and I hesitate to call it interference. It's almost like communication. It is communication, I think. And it was interesting when I was talking with you earlier. We have to stop. We have to stop talking to each other and ask them to stop so that we can continue discussing whatever it is that we're discussing. And I was very curious to see, knowing who you are and what your gifts are, if there will be anything that happens tonight. Because as you're very well aware, and as we learned living at the farm, the spirits love and are comfortable with electronic equipment. They would mess with our radios, our stereo system, the television. They learned how to start the dishwasher. Stephen, I'm not kidding you. They learned how to start the dishwasher.
Now, if they could just learn to unload the thing. Right?
Oh, that would have been a blessing. It truly would. But they would start the dishwasher when there was absolutely nothing in it. It was, of course, before the days of microwaves, but they would mess around with the phone. Not only physically lift the receiver on the phone. We had an old-fashioned wall unit in our kitchen, and then a more old-fashioned one in the parlor. And they would lift the handle up off the phone and just let it levitate out in the air. And then when somebody'd walk into the room, it would hang itself back up very quickly, but to be noticed, certainly to be noticed. And then there were many times that we'd try to call away from the farm, or someone would try to call us, and there was just white noise, or there would be inexplicable comments made that came obviously from another realm. That was not it was not any voice that any of us were familiar with, and it seems to be the frequencies that they most enjoy. I don't know what your experience is with that, but it's a rather chronic problem in my life.
Well, it's on last week's show, I had a wonderful guest on, Pat Boussard, and she was kind of giving me a little mini reading, and all of a sudden this voice breaks in, and I clipped it out of last week's audio. I'll play it on my show sometime soon, but I don't know what it was. We were on the telephone, we weren't even on Skype, and it said, hello, Mom? And I said, we got a spirit breaking in on the line. And it said hello again, so I responded hello, and then it sounded just like Curly on the Three Stooges. He said, funny, that's priceless. And I'm like, that was odd. And Pat came right back on, kept right on talking, never heard a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it was so clear here and over the air Also, I believe I mentioned to you, Andrea, before we came on air, about a telephone call I got one time, and it did not register on my voicemail as an incoming call. It did not register as a number on my ID. All it showed on the display was one voicemail. I picked it up, replayed it, and it was just static white noise. But in that static, I heard a female whisper say very clearly, "Your house is haunted," like that, and no record of the call. So yes, I definitely believe that they're using the same technology we are to communicate. Now, I'm not sure how.
I'm not sure how either, but I think that it's very easy for them, that the frequencies that, I think that when we tune into their frequency, in other words, when we use technology and machinery that they're somehow familiar with or is on a different wavelength, when you think about radio waves, it makes perfect sense. And when you think about Skype and the connection from satellite, it makes even more sense. But I'm not all that sure that what comes through is necessarily always spirits. And I don't want to delve too deeply in that, but I have heard some things that were electronic transmissions and sounds that sounded as though someone was speaking to me through a synthesizer, and very clearly speaking through a synthesized machine that created a staccato effect in the wavelength in terms of the words, and so it was difficult to discern the words. And that's frustrating to me, because if they want, whoever it is that wants to communicate with me, if they're able to break into my equipment, if they're able to hang my phone up when I'm doing an interview with someone and disconnect the call when I start talking about something that they don't want to hear about, a certain name to be mentioned, or, when I start talking about Bathsheba, generally there is some interference because she's not happy, not even a little bit, especially because of the film. Since they started making the movie about our story and the Warrens' investigation of our property back in the early 1970s, there's been one incident after another where there had been quiet for decades.
Well, I think you're probably, much like myself, a haunted person. Have you found that other places you've lived other than the house in your book, have you experienced any activity at your other abodes since then? Other than spirit breaking in on Skype.
Yeah, well, how to answer that? Yes, my whole life. But I don't call myself a psychic. I don't label myself anything. I think that what I experience of this life and the connection that I have with spirit and with the afterlife is such that it would almost diminish it to label it. Because when I think of someone who is an empath, a sensitive, a medium, a psychic, it's almost like you decompartmentalize what the characteristics of that particular person would be. And in terms of my experiences lifelong, I would say that at one time or another, I have fallen into virtually every category and then some.
Well, and we're all individuals, and we're all different in our gifts. So I think it is hard to categorize a person and what their gift might be. Now, myself, I use electronics to try to give spirit a voice. And it was very scary for me in the beginning because I kind of stumbled into it. But your father seemed like a rational person, and I was just wondering, how did he wrap his mind around the concept that the house he just purchased was in fact haunted? How did he come to grips with that?
It took him a very long time, and in so doing, he pretty successfully managed to alienate my mother and to distance his children from him, because we were all having experiences that were so profound, that were so meaningful to us and so frightening to most of us, that I didn't have an issue in terms of fear. I was absolutely fascinated. But I was a little older. I was 12 years old when we moved into the house, and I was rather intellectually precocious anyway. I was reading Emerson's essays at 10. So, I was rather open to what the universe had in store for me as I grew older. But it was very difficult because my father had his own business and was away from home a lot. And when he'd come home, even if something happened, he would immediately try to explain it away and come up with, one rational explanation after another, when the rest of us all knew that it was the same thing that had happened 3 days before when he wasn't there. And I go into some great depth in terms of the deterioration and the eventual disintegration of my parents' marriage. And it really did begin with that. My father changed. He's never been a particularly easy person. He's got a rather gruff side to him. But when we moved to the house, it changed him in inexplicable ways. And his reaction to the haunting in our house was anger. And the more angry he got, the more active the spirits became, to the extent that when he would leave to go on a business trip, the 6 of us that remained would breathe a collective sigh of relief, because we knew that his absence in the house would automatically tamp down the spiritual activity. And I'll tell you, the strangest thing, the thing that is really explored in Volume 2 and then later, I think, reconciled in Volume 3, is that my father eventually did come to terms with the fact that they existed, even though he was never happy about it. But he did have a kinship, as it were, with the spirit that was tormenting my mother, absolutely tormenting my mother. And she would sidle up to him and touch him and be close to him. And she would literally, in my opinion, she would be the cause of the things that would break down, the mechanical objects in our cellar that would break down, because nothing ever broke down unless Dad was home. And if Dad was home, something would break down, which would force him to go down into the cellar, and that's where she would always make contact with him. One time, she came to him, and he got so scared that he said something very ugly to her, and she slammed the cellar door, and she wouldn't come around him for months afterwards. Months passed before she forgave him. But at one point, she finally did forgive him, and it wasn't not long before we actually left the house. And he kicks himself all the time now. He said, if I hadn't been so afraid of what was manifesting right in front of me, if I hadn't have lost my temper, what she could have told me, if she had actually taken form, what she could have told me, and now I'll never know. So he's come to realize that he made some really serious mistakes in terms of his, not only the way that he dealt with his family. I mean, his wife, my mother, would just as soon chew her arm off as lie to anyone, not just to her husband. And for him to in any way doubt her veracity was beyond insulting. And for his 5 little girls not to be free to go to him and say, Daddy, I'm scared, because his reaction action would be even scarier than the spirits. It was a tough way to grow up, and by the time he came around, it was too late. He had really alienated all of us.
Well, I think you mentioned anger. When he's projecting that anger, that is negative emotion or negative energy into that environment, and some spirits seem to feed on that negativity or that anger or fear. And
The energy that's created from the anger is what they seemed to latch on to. And the thing is that even my mother told him, and Mrs. Warren told him, not to fight, that Mom and Dad should not fight in that house, because all it does is, she would say, it feeds the beast. It feeds the beast. And yet it's like they couldn't help it. They were so juxtaposed in their opinions about what was happening and why, and he would blame her and she would hate him, and we would run for cover. It was worse living with my parents growing up in terms of the contempt that was building between them than it was actually living with the spirits.
Would you think he could have been angry at himself, maybe putting blame on himself for putting his family into this situation?
I think that he was the one and only man of the family, and he was not in control of anything. It was his job as the head of the family to be the protector, to be the provider, to keep his family safe, and he couldn't. He couldn't. And I think that that's what made him angry more than anything, was that every time that subject came up, he got that visceral feeling of, I have no control over this situation. And I really do believe, and even when I talk to him about it now, I mean, I have an entirely different relationship with my father now that he has evolved. And we can talk very openly about these things now. And he looked at me. I was with him this past weekend. He came to Atlanta to do Through the Veil with me. And we were on our way back home. And all of a sudden, he just turned and he looked at me and he said, I was such a jerk. And I said, oh, Dad, you're being far too kind to yourself.
Well, Andrea, hold that thought. With that, I believe we're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back.
Dixie Ghostland Paracon, Aiken, South Carolina, July the 27th and 28th, 2013. www.lightstream-media.com. 4 major paranormal and historical hotspots, paranormal celebrities, paranormal acknowledgments and awards. Come see paranormal celebrity Blaine Rohan of Scare Radio International, Stephen Hill, author of Something Unseen and radio host of Alternative Frequencies, Andrea Perron, author of the trilogy House of Darkness, House of Light, Jason Staton of Ghost Chat Radio, The Paranormal Rebel with Sepia, co-manager of TAPS, Jeff Leeper. Also see Daryl Campbell of My Ghost Story Caught on Camera, the entire team of paranormal pros, Kim Brulette and Chris Matheny, co-authors of Secrets in the Shallows, and radio hosts. See the Bama Boys of Deep South Paranormal, Sci-Fi, and Keith Age of Spook TV and the Orb Tones. Come to Dixie Ghostland Paracon, www.lightstream-media.com.
If you'd like to find out more about Something Unseen, you can do so by visiting Amazon. Check out The True Story of My Haunting, Something Unseen.
The views and opinions expressed on this network do not reflect anyone here. Thank goodness, because there's a reason we're all on radio instead of TV. Therefore, we shall not be responsible for any personal injury, property damage, accident, delay, world wars, sudden appearance of unwanted nose hairs or blemishes, collapse of the World Bank, freak accidents, delays, or inconvenience, or more importantly, being out of chocolate fudge ripple ice cream at Ben & Jerry's. history.
Ay, caramba!
We take responsibility for nothing. We know nothing and will admit to nothing.
You're listening to Alternative Frequencies with host Stephen Hill. Now back to the show.
And we're back from that break with my special guest, Andrea Perron, author of House of Darkness, House of Light. Andrea, we were talking about before the break your father and how he came to grips with the haunting that your family was undergoing, all the strange experiences. And we were talking about anger and how you felt like, or it seemed that he was injecting that anger into the environment and causing the activity to decrease. I find that very interesting, and in my experience, they do feed on that negative energy. Now, how is your mother handling this?
How did my mother handle it then, or how is she handling it now?
Well, then and now.
Okay. How many hours do we have for this show?
Well, I guess a short version.
Okay.
When she
right.
realized
That's
that the house,
asking not to breathe. My mother is an extremely enlightened person. I will tell you that she's highly intelligent, and my father is as well. But my mother's different. There's something very special about her, and she's an extremely open-minded person. And even though we moved into that house, none of us, certainly not any of us, the children, but neither of my parents even considered the possibility that we were moving into a haunted house. And so when we actually got into that very crowded environment and discovered that we were sharing space with centuries of spirits that had come from not only different decades, but different centuries, especially based on the different garb that we would see them in and that type of thing, she became frightened, but also very fascinated, where my father was king of denial. He just didn't want to deal with it, didn't want to discuss it, didn't want to think about it, didn't want to hear anything. And every time something would happen in the house, it would spawn this outburst from him that would be very disconcerting to everyone else in the family. However, I wonder what you were talking about in terms of that, because there were times when it seemed like the altercations that would occur between my parents would actually heighten the activity in the house. And then there were times when the spirits would just essentially say, enough, and something would happen to stop the fight. Something as innocuous as a bottle flying off the kitchen counter, going across the room that was 15 feet across, slamming into a wall, and landing on the floor without a single chip in it. Nothing. It was not damaged in any way, and yet it should have been busted into a million pieces. That was enough to make both of them stop. And I sometimes wonder if there were spirits in the house that were as troubled by what they were hearing and seeing as we were. So it was a very difficult way to grow up, Stephen. It was the thing that was most difficult about it was having to pretend that it didn't exist, because it wasn't long before we as children started chatting amongst the other kids that we went to school with, and very shortly had the reputation of, the Perron girls that live up on Round Top, that they live in that old haunted house. Those girls are really weird. And before you knew it, we were losing friendships. People's parents were calling the school saying that those Perron girls were scaring their kids. And so we learned at a very early age to shut our mouths.
Well, you mentioned losing friends. When I came out of the closet, paranormal-wise, some of my fishing buddies don't call me to go fishing anymore. And, and that's sad because it makes you just think, were they really my friends to begin with?
Right. Well, and when you feel yourself being ostracized because of what I perceive to be a God-given gift, it is painful. And when I look back on that decade now, I realize that I grew up in a portal that was cleverly disguised as a farmhouse. I realized that it was the best decade of my life because it taught me everything that I needed to know about life and death and the afterlife. I knew from the day we moved in that there was something beyond our mortal existence, even though I was only 12 years old, and now I'm 54, and I cannot tell you any more about what it is now than I could when I was 12. But I do know that it exists, and I do know that we are essentially spirit. And I've lived my entire life feeling very much a misfit, and it wasn't until we moved to the farm that I felt a sense of home for the first time in my life. And from the day we left the farm, I've never had that sense of home anywhere I've ever been since. And it's very difficult to describe, but I do know that, at least for myself, and I can only speak for myself, I was drawn to that house, and I think my mother was drawn to that house. She's the one that discovered it. Quite inexplicably discovered the house. It was as if the entire universe converged. There was something happened. The reason that I start volume 1 of this story in Cumberland, Rhode Island, is because a series of bizarre, inexplicable events occurred while we were living in the sleepy, bucolic bedroom community of Providence in Cumberland, Rhode Island. And what happened, each consecutive incident that happened, convinced my mother more and more that she needed to remove her children from this environment and go find a place in the country. And so all of these things that occurred prior to the day she found the farm and went to look at it and then convinced my father to come look at it, all led up with purpose and reason, I believe. And when we got to the house, Cindy, I told you, Cindy, my little sister, next to the youngest, April is the youngest, would crawl into bed and would talk to me at night and ask me questions and try to make some sense out of it herself. And she would crawl in bed and say, you know, I keep seeing this little girl, and she keeps walking through my room, and she's either holding a book or she's got something tucked under her arm, and she cries and cries for her mommy. And Annie, she looks just like you. Well, Cindy was always telling me that she looked like she was maybe 5 years old. And for Cindy to know what I looked like at 5 years old, she had to rely on family photographs because she was just born when I was 5. So in her mind, I was identical to this little ghost, and I only caught a glimpse of her once, and I looked away because I didn't want to see myself in her. And then when I was just about to turn 18 years old, I'd already gone off to college, and I came home. Actually, I whined so much that my father and mother flew me home for a 3-day weekend over my birthday, which always coincides with Columbus Day weekend. And I had eaten on the plane, and when I came home, I just felt the cold. The cold was just overwhelming in the house, and I thought I was just tired. I didn't make the connection, but I passed on dinner. Everybody else went to the dining room. There was a huge opening between the parlor and the dining room. I went directly to the fireplace, just put my luggage down on the parlor floor and walked directly to the fireplace. And my father went to the head of the table. The rest of my family gathered, and we were talking through the 2 rooms to each other. And all of a sudden, Dad dropped his fork, And I looked up, and he was staring at me, but he wasn't actually staring at me. He was staring beside me to my right. And he said, "Annie, someone's come to welcome you home." And I couldn't move the right side of my body. I couldn't move my body, but I turned my head, and I looked directly into the eyes of an old woman, but they were my eyes. It was my facial features. It was my hair, all twisted up in a bun, and she was dressed in 17th century garb, and she smiled very sweetly at me, and I can't even put into words the sensation that passed through my body and the thoughts that passed through my mind. And I didn't even tell anybody in my family. Everybody had known that there was a spirit next to me, and she disappeared right in front of everyone after she smiled at me. But I never told anybody in my family that I was looking at what I perceived to be myself from 200 years prior.
Well, do you think it possibly could have been the apparition of your great-great-great-great-great-grandmother?
We can't find any ancestral connection between our family in terms of, our background. My father is pure French, and my mother is Cherokee Indian, English, Scottish, I believe some Irish, Dutch, Heinz 57 variety when you put them all together and create 5 little kids. And we can't find a connection between the Arnold family or the Richardson family. But I will tell you something absolutely bizarre. My sister Nancy, her first love of her life was a young man named Eddie Richardson. His, I believe, great-great-great-grandfather, or it might go back even farther than that, but the man who built the house was named Richardson, and for many years it was known as the Dexter Richardson homestead. And one day Nancy comes home with Eddie Richardson by the hand and introduces him to her whole family, and from the minute he stepped over the threshold, that house went nuts. And he was never afraid. He was very open to it. And my mother, of course, told him that one of his ancestors that came from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, one of the original Pilgrims, had built the house. And he always said he had such a very strong sense of feeling at home while he was there. Excuse me. And Eddie's story was very tragic. Eddie was one of 7 people who were close to our family who repeatedly visited the house, whose lives ended very tragically, very prematurely. And so I used to be uncomfortable when people would describe our family as those that survived that haunting. But I've come to terms with that, and I realize that that's a pretty accurate assessment, because a lot of the people that came to our home didn't survive.
Well, and there's, depression, there's spirit oppression, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've been subjected to a little bit of that myself during my journey. But, when I first realized there was an afterlife, it went completely against my religious upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
And just changed my outlook on reality. And it was hard to come to grips with. And when the activity started happening around the house, and it started affecting my wife and my dog as well, I almost felt ashamed. It's like, what have I done to deserve this? What in the hell have I brought into this house?
Yes.
And, but I learned through my journey that it's not such a scary thing. Of course, I write about in my book, Something Unseen, the true story of my haunting, how I became my own client as far as investigating my own haunting. And when I started hunting them, it wasn't so scary anymore. But I don't see apparitions. I've seen a ghost cat we have around here, but I don't see apparitions of spirit. Talking to them doesn't bother me in the least. But, I just don't know how you cope with things manifesting right in front of your eyes.
Well, one of the most fascinating stories that happened in our house, and the reason why I describe the farmhouse as a portal to the past as well as to the future, is because my mother was, I believe, in the most accurate as being oppressed. And considering my mother's behavior, her change in language, her change in dress, I believe that the spirit, whoever she was, that was trying to rid the house of my mother to claim her position as mistress of the house and to claim my father, she lusted after my father and she coveted us, the 5 children, and she loathed my mother. When she couldn't get her to leave the house, it was as though she began to try to claim her from within. And my mother went through a dramatic transformation that was, it was gradual, but it was certainly noticeable. Even her voice changed. Wow. And that's what really alarmed Mr. and Mrs. Warren. And during, I think, their 5th or 6th visit to the house, they showed up with an entourage, and they didn't warn my mother in advance about what was going to happen. And my father had just arrived home from a business trip, and he was tired, and he did not want company, and he certainly didn't want paranormal company in the house. And when they showed up, they came with a crew, they came with techs and state-of-the-art camera equipment for the time, and audio equipment, and a priest, and a medium, and he was wild. He was livid. And that night, my mother, knowing that they were coming, suggested that we go visit friends, go spend the night elsewhere. Well, 2 of us were able to negotiate that, and the rest of us, it was just too short notice. And so April and Cindy and myself, actually Christine was home too. She slept through everything. Nancy took off and went over to Katie's house. But the rest of us were home, and we were told to stay upstairs. But Cindy and I, being disobedient heathens, came downstairs, and we happened to see virtually everything that occurred that night. And a seance occurred. And something came, the Warrens opened a door that they could not close. They could not control what came through. And what came through was not one of the spirits with which we were so familiar. What came through was something so ugly and so evil and so not of this world that it changed the way that I think about everything. And that was the only time in my life that I have been that frightened. It was the only time that we lived in that house that I was terrified out of my mind. And it was because I thought I watched my mother die.
Well, when you open a door, or the door opened itself, seemingly in your case, I think, along with spirits, that dark beings can also come through. And possibly that's what you were dealing with on that night.
This spoke through my mother, though, and it spoke in a language that I know does not exist on this planet. It spoke with a hatefulness. It could very easily have killed her. It didn't want to kill her. What it wanted to do was make its presence known to everyone else in the room. And Lorraine Warren, for all these years, have claimed consistently that the Perron haunting was the most, these are their words, the most intense, the most compelling, the most disturbing, and singularly the most significant haunting that they ever investigated. And the investigation they conducted was very thorough. They, for what they had at their disposal at the time, brought all of their tools and all of their wisdom to bear and tried as much as they could to help us. And we all do believe that they came sincerely to help us. But unfortunately, what they were dealing with in that house was bigger and uglier and more evil than anything that either of them ever encountered before or since. And on Ed's deathbed, he asked Lorraine if she would do everything in her power in the years that she had left to make sure that this story got told, because it was so important. And we didn't tell anybody what happened to us, and there are a number of reasons why. First of all, each one of us wants to, we worked very hard for 3 decades to bury these memories. And I told you earlier, we could leave the house, but the house will never leave us. And one night, I guess it was around midnight, my mom and I were up and having a cup of tea and playing a game of Scrabble, and she looked across the table at me and she said, we worked for years and years to bury our dead. And when it came time to exhume them, it's amazing how close to the surface they were buried. When we put our stories together, Stephen, I thought there would be discrepancies left and right. It was identical. Nancy's matched Christine's, matched Cindy's, matched April's, matched mine, matched Mom's, matched Dad's. It was amazing. I had a 1,380-page manuscript, and when I went through it and did my comparative analysis story for story, I was wrong on one thing. I had to change one season of an episode from spring to fall. That is literally the only change that I had to make in the manuscript.
Well, that's what I call validation for your experiences. Everybody had the same experience. Everybody tells the same story. That's great. Yeah.
When something like this happens to you, as you well know, it is seared into your memory. It is impaled into your mind, and it can be re-triggered by the most innocuous things. Even the scent of something in the air, or the sound of, the 3 opening notes of a song, and instantly you're right back. It's right there. It's one of my favorite lines in the book, if I could be so bold, is to compliment myself. One of my favorite lines is childhood trauma, the gift that keeps on giving.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's you never ever get away from it. And in fact, I live in a darling little farm just west of Atlanta with my sister Christine and my mother. I was the lone holdout. I was still living in Rhode Island when the bell went off in my head. It's time to tell the story. And talk about validation. I hadn't even discussed doing this with any of my family, but I've known since the age of 12 that I'd eventually be the one. And I journaled all through the years that we lived there and since, and talked about my feelings and my experiences and what I came in contact with and what I met from the other side and what happened in our house. And when I went off to college, my sisters would write me letters. We'd call it the ghost post, and they would write to me things that happened in the house. Or we'd talk on the phone, and I would make notes and add it into my journals. So I had that whole decade chronicled. And when I look back on it now, and I realize that it was my job to tell their story, not just to tell my family's mortal story, but to tell the immortal side of the tale as well. And I feel very privileged to have been essentially chosen to fulfill that role. And I truly hope that if what I saw in terms of manifestations of spirits in that house, who so strikingly resembled me, if by telling this tale and bringing it out into the world and daring the skeptics and enduring the scrutiny that will inevitably come around it, if that's what liberates me and releases me from going back again to live in that farm in another lifetime, then it's worth it to me. And I don't care what anybody says. At some point you get to an age and you get to a level of consciousness where you simply don't care what anyone else has to say about this, because they haven't lived in your shoes. They haven't experienced what you have. And I welcome the skeptics. And the reason that I do is because they're the ones that push all the rest of us to come up with more and more and more evidence. And I don't expect anyone who hasn't ever experienced what I've experienced in life to be, completely open to the suggestion of it or to claim themselves to be a believer. I get that. But the fact of the matter is that the stories that we tell in this collective memoir, some of which are so extreme, they literally require a leap of faith in order for you to buy into the notion that this actually happened. And that was why we waited so long. It took more than 30 years for me to begin to chronicle this on paper. And when I did, I realized that the time had come, and I felt utterly validated when I got my first call from a Hollywood producer before I told anyone about this. And the reason that I did was because at the same time that I began writing the book, Mrs. Warren began looking for someone to tell this story on film. And she needed my permission or to be in touch with my family in order to do it.
And don't you, I know in my case, in the writing of my book, it was kind of like therapy for me.
I understand what you're saying, yeah.
And, you know, I hope it was for you as well, because a trilogy is a lot of book to write, I'm going to tell you.
It took 3 years. It took 3 solid years, anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And when you put yourself out there, and you know, as you are, and as I have and do, you know, it can be a scary thing, because at first you're afraid, well, what will people think of me? But then you realize if this is what you're supposed, you know, meant to do, you're doing what you're supposed to do. And I think I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, and obviously you are too. I think, like you say, you just get to a point where you know, okay, I'm sharing, this is my story, I'm going to share it with you, and if you don't believe me, then that's okay. As a matter of fact, in the first paragraph of my book, I give my disclaimer. If you think me insane, then it's okay. You won't be the first, and at times I've thought so myself. So there's my disclaimer, and that's kind of the way I feel about it. If you know, I can't sway a skeptical mind. The only way he's going to be swayed is to experience something that causes him to come outside of his belief system. And I think that's scarier than admitting that there is an afterlife to the skeptic, because it takes him outside his belief system. I'm sure
if we have a couple of minutes, Stephen, I would really like to share with you my disclaimer from the opening of the first volume.
Sure.
And it's called Prologue in Prayer. And I start each chapter or each writing in the books, it opens with a quotation that's pertinent, relevant to what I'm discussing, and then I close it with the same. And the opening quotation is, "Convinced myself, I seek not to convince," by Edgar Allan Poe. Let me put my cheating glasses on. I'm so glad we're not on video.
And by the way, Poe's one of my favorite poets of all time.
Truly. The telling of this story is not intended to persuade the reader of its authenticity. Those who believe in the existence of the spirit world will not require convincing. Those who do not believe so will likely remain skeptical. It matters that this tale be told with honesty and integrity. Embarking upon the journey has been scary in its own right. For the past 40 years, the family involved has remained guarded and exclusive about their mutual experience. Delving into the painful memories has proved difficult, rekindling imagery, disturbing emotions long repressed. Exhuming the dead spawned its share of nightmares, and yet it is a tale worthy of telling because it is true, a collective memoir worthy of sharing because of the message a family received. It is a tale of good and evil, life and death, darkness and light. Evil exists. One need only tune in the nightly news to establish this sad, distressing fact. It is as powerful as invisible. We witness myriad manifestations of evil, yet it is essentially an intangible force, an intention to deliberately inflict harm. At times it appears as if evil is winning the battle against what is good and pure, kind and sane in this world. The balance seems skewed. Earth's news is so very bad. Omnipresent issues of war and peace. Let there be light. Truth be told, the human race is immersed in goodness and light. Evil has yet to prevail, though the struggle between them is real. Philosophers and laymen alike, from the greatest minds in history to those merely curious, have wrestled with the concept. Presuming the existence of good and evil, this narrative explores the nature of life and the transcendence of death. It poses questions, yet does not seek answers, nor will it provide any substantive guidance. There are no definitive answers in this realm. For those who lived through it, the mystery remains. It is time to divulge their closely guarded secrets. The time has come to tell the truth. Acquiring knowledge through direct experience is a blessing and a curse. It defines, then redefines. Once something so extraordinary has been witnessed, there is no escaping the imagery impaled in a memory. It cannot be explained, and it cannot be denied. There is no legitimate reason to dismiss otherwise consistently reliable senses. Ultimately, we do believe our eyes. We should. Certainty of knowledge informs all else in life, including the inevitability of death and the consequences for souls who linger suspended in the ether. In the vast continuum of time and space, there are ramifications for mortal and immortal alike. The following story chronicles this series of phenomenal encounters and metaphysical moments, events which transformed the seven involved in the saga. What the family endured together was absorbed individually, resulting in an intensely personal search as each one discovered their own spirituality, developing a fundamental belief system based upon what they experienced dwelling for a decade in a house alive with death. Those years provided them with hearth and home, then gifted them with an explicit knowledge regarding the inherent complexities of life as it intersects the mysteries of death. Each member of the family believes they were privileged to have a powerful truth revealed in their presence, considering what they had shared was nothing less than the stunning realization there is indeed some form of existence beyond mortal death. Affirming a belief in spirit, what became their core assumption gradually evolved into simple, certain, steadfast faith. There is a tendency for time and distance to ease and clarify consciousness, distilling the truth, instilling a sense of peace, replenishing hope where once only torment prevailed. A family's private recollections, intimate knowledge of spirit is no longer burdensome to them. Instead, they consider it to be an awe-inspiring responsibility, sharing the belief that they have kept their secrets long enough, perhaps too long. The writer believes everything happens in its proper moment in time, with purpose and reason, perfection intrinsic to the universe. The cast of characters, both living and dead, is extensive, yet the house has the lead. Many have come and gone from this place in the country, some far more quickly than others. It has acquired quite the reputation over the years, legitimately so. Some have departed in reverence, others have reportedly run for their lives, literally and figuratively. Then there are those who were born, spent their lifetime, and died in this fascinating farmhouse, some of whom never left it at all. What happens in this house is infinitely more significant than to whom it happens, the essential truth of the story. The Perron family requested this tale of darkness and light be honestly told. It contains no embellishment, merely a modicum of literary license regarding dialogue, though some is quite precise. Their intention is not to entertain, but rather to inform. The writer humbly respects their request, yet as daughter and sister, as one of seven dwelling in the shadow of death during an illuminating decade of life, it is a given. This story is something sacred. And my closing quotation is, "It's not the answer that enlightens, but the question."
Very true, and that was wonderful. Andrea, we are out of time. I can't wait to meet you in person next month at the Dixie Ghostland Paracon in Aiken, South Carolina. That is going to be a wonderful event.
Oh, it's going to be a rockin' good time, Stephen. I can't wait to meet you there. We'll have a blast. I hope that they can get The Conjuring to run in the theater that weekend. That would be wonderful, because that'll be its first full weekend.
Wow.
So we'll see. We'll see if they've got it up and running at the theater in Aiken.
Can't wait to see that. That would be so awesome. And tell everyone very quickly where they can purchase your book.
Well, the best and the fastest way and the least expensive way to get it is to go to authorhouse.com and click on the bookstore. Now, Author House is also in the UK, so it's authorhouse.com UK, and you can get it there. Amazon carries it. Barnes & Noble carries it. It's virtually available anywhere online from your favorite bookseller, and a lot of the bookstores in the United States, especially in New England, are starting to carry the trilogy now. It takes a little while for that to catch on. There's only 10 or 12,000 books a year published, but it's getting a reputation in New England now, so it's available in a lot of the brick and mortar stores as well.
Well, thank you again. You've been a great guest, and we hope to talk with you soon.
I will see you in Aiken, and I will be in touch with you soon as well. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight, Stephen. It was my pleasure to do your broadcast.
Pleasure was all mine, and thank you.
Have a lovely evening, dear.
You too. Good night.
Good night, hon.
Well, this has been Alternative Frequencies. Special thanks to the Hazy Radio Network, Birmingham City Radio UK, author Andrea Perron, and those on the other side. Until next week, good night.